this computer. All right, I'm getting better at Zoom. I've had to learn on my feet since we switched from Google to Zoom, and I think we've got it now. So let us, there we go. Let me know if there's any issues with the sound or anything like that. Hey, welcome back. This is part 9 of the Space Between YouTube series, in which we are exploring the space between the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Hopefully you remember last week we talked a lot about John Hyrcanus, the ruler / high priest in Judea, who led all kinds of conquests in the area to recapture the kingdom that had once belonged to David and Solomon like 1,000 years earlier. You'll remember he's the one who forcibly converted all the Gentiles. He burned down the Samaritan temple, and just a lot of questionable decisions about how to remake an empire. So let's just jump right into it. Speaking of questionable decisions, we need to meet his sons, because he didn't live forever, and so he passed on his authority to his sons. Now we're going to skip over his older son, because Aristobulus only lived for 1 year as king before he died of natural causes, and we get to skip straight on to Alexander Jannaeus, because boy, howdy, was that guy awful. So right away, when Alexander took the throne, he did 3 important things. First of all, he assumed the title of king and high priest. Previously, other than his brother, they had just been the ruler, the leader, the ethnarch. They had not been the king, because the kingship, as it is generally thought of by the Pharisees and the people who study the Bible, and not just the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, like the Sadducees do, they know that the kinghood belongs to the line of David, that was supposed to be, God made a covenant with David that his descendants should rule over Judea for all eternity. And so he's not from David's line, and so this is kind of a big deal. But he did it anyway. Second thing he did was he married his brother's childless widow, Salome Alexandra. This is pretty common if your brother dies and his widow had not conceived a child yet, that you marry her so that those children then continue on in your brother's legacy. It's called a Levirate marriage. And then 3, proceeded to just leave her in charge while he went off to war to continue in his father's great tradition of conquering everything around him. Because why not? So by all accounts, Salome Alexandra, his wife, was brilliant. She was faithful to God. She was well-read in the scriptures. She was extremely diplomatic. And while her husband was rash and vindictive and obsessed with power and war, she was this really great balancing force in that land. And this came to a head in about 99 BC. So again, remember, this is less than 100 years before the birth of Jesus. When Alexander Jannaeus came back from war and to preside over the feast of Sukkot in the temple, and the Pharisees there were not at all pleased with him because of a whole bunch of reasons I won't get into that all stem really from his taking of the title of king and high priest. And so while he's doing the required ceremony of pouring out water, he's supposed to pour it out onto the altar. He knew this, and he looked at the Pharisees and instead poured it out on the floor onto his feet. And they went bonkers because this was meant to offend them. And so they started throwing citrus fruits at him. I just love this mental picture. You have a high priest / king who's just come back from war and is so petty that he intentionally messes up the sacrifice, the ritual at the altar just to annoy his enemies. And they respond by throwing lemons at him. Well, not lemons, but, citrus fruit that they... I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is all just hilarious. And I don't know if you know this, but you really should not do that. You really should not pelt the high priest slash king slash warlord with lemons, which is maybe why in Acts 23, when Paul accidentally insults the high priest Ananias, and it comes to his attention that he has called the high priest a whitewashed wall, he immediately apologizes and is like, "Oh, sorry, the Bible says you're not supposed to insult your leaders. My bad, sorry." He may have been thinking about this interaction, because what happened next was, well, I mean, you can probably guess what happened next. After getting lemons thrown at you while you're trying to do your job, he ordered their slaughter, and 6,000 people were killed in Jerusalem that day. So maybe don't throw lemons at the high priest. Maybe don't throw lemons at your pastor. Just don't throw lemons, okay? Let's just make that a general rule. No throwing lemons. So after this incident, this led to a civil war, like a legit bloody civil war with armies and everything, and outside influences and mercenary armies between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And when all was said and done, thousands of people were killed, towns were burned down, and in the end, when Alexander won, he had 800 Pharisees crucified along the public road, and while they were being crucified, he had their wives and children brought out and killed in front of them, while he was hosting a huge drunken banquet with all of his concubines in view of this and laughing the whole time. So don't throw lemons at your high priest is the moral of the story. No, the moral of the story is the guy was awful, and there is no reason he should have been in charge of the temple at all. So remember, on a side note, when the Pharisees and Sadducees in the New Testament are kind of going at each other, it's not just a theological dispute. That thing that happened is still in living memory. This is like 130 years before we meet them in the New Testament, when Jesus is interacting with them. This could have been like their great-grandparents, their grandparents. Like, this is still pretty recent. This is this grab for control and for legitimacy. So, as you can imagine, Alexander dies in war. Surprise, surprise. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. But on his deathbed, he hands the leadership role not over to one of his two sons, who are adults, but over to his wife, Salome. And I mean, honestly, probably because she was doing most of the work anyway for the past 30 years while they were married and he was off waging war and having lemons thrown at him. She was doing all of the administrative work and the diplomatic work, and she was really making everything happen anyway. So a smooth transition of power would have just been let her take over. And so she did. But on his deathbed, he said to her, "My one request is that you would unite the Pharisees and Sadducees. Bring them together in unity and in peace." Isn't that rich? Like, this is a guy that just crucified 800 Pharisees, murdered their families in front of them, and now he's asking on his deathbed, "Oh, wifey, can you please just make them all better? Why can't they like each other? I want you to make them feel better." But guess what? Salome's amazing, and she pulls it off. Yeah. So while her husband was this rash and violent Sadducee, she was a wise and judicious Pharisee. And her brother was the head of the Pharisees. Plus, she'd, like I said, basically been doing the job for 30 years, so it was an easy transition. So when she took over, because she was not allowed to serve as high priest as a woman, she appointed her oldest son, another Pharisee by the name of Hyrcanus II, to be the high priest. So now there was distance between the crown and the temple, and the Pharisees were happy. Plus, they were now in power. So then she reformed the group of elders in the temple, the sort of unofficial rulers, and she formed the official Sanhedrin. And she mixed it up with a lot of Pharisees in order to have equal representation, and set it up to be a kind of Supreme Court that would judge on various issues that she didn't want to, or that were really difficult. So they were kind of the ones who were making sure that laws were being followed, and determining how to interpret the Torah and the laws and all of that. And when the Pharisees regained control, and a lot of them came back because they had fled, gone to Syria and to Egypt. When they had came back, as you can imagine, there was some retributive violence where the Pharisees fought back against the Sadducees because now they were in power and they could do the oppressing. And so when the Sadducees came to her and said, "Save us from these people," instead of saying, "Oh, now you're sorry? Suck it up, Buttercup." Instead, she built fortified cities outside of Jerusalem for the Sadducees to go live in, so they would be safe. So they would have a place of safety to live and to raise their families while this time of national healing could happen. Which was, again, wise and judicious and diplomatic. It's kind of who she was. So then, along with the Pharisees, her brother being a big deal in that, they set up what may be the very first state-funded public schooling system in human history. So to that point, it was expected that every father would teach his son about Torah and about God. Then you have kind of amateurs teaching children. And if you didn't have a father, you could go to Jerusalem and be taught, but really that's just for the rich people because poor folks can't afford to send their kids to boarding school. So this ruling came down that every single town, anyone that had more than 10 people, was to have a school, an elementary school and a high school, in which boys and girls would be taught how to read and to memorize Scripture and the interpretation of Scripture, and be taught how to engage with their faith. This is revolutionary. I mean, let alone the egalitarian nature of it, of having boys and girls together, but also having state-funded education systems. Really didn't come up again for a very long time after this. Now, obviously, the Sadduceical elite was not appreciative of this, because their power came directly from being in charge and having the sole authority to interpret Scripture and to run the sacrifices in the temple. And so they're starting to lose a foothold to the Pharisees. And now an entire generation of Jewish children is going to be educated by the Pharisees according to their interpretation and their oral tradition. And you can start to see the power slipping away from the Sadducees. This might come up and be a problem again in the future. We will see. But this is really the time when this great Jewish tradition of debate really flowers and blossoms. This is one of the things that I have been so blessed about in growing in friendship with a lot of Jewish people, and especially my rabbi friends, is this spirit of debate, of digging into truths and of listening to other opinions and pulling apart the Scriptures and your precious theologies and turning it around and looking at it from different angles. And this is kind of really starting to come alive right now, and they're teaching children how to do this kind of thing. You imagine like it was in the Protestant Reformation when the Reformers translated the Bible into the common language and gave it to the people, and the people could read it for the first time, and were encouraged to become a nation of priests. And what you ended up with was that the Catholic Church lost a lot of power, and religious ideas and interpretations took off in every direction. I mean, we have like 80,000 Protestant denominations now, so maybe it wasn't the best thing. But this kind of thing is starting to happen here in Judea as well. And as the religious powers of the priesthood begin to shift towards the people, the Sadducees fought back. Well, one particular Sadducee in particular, this is being Salome's younger son, Aristobulus II, because he, like his father, was a Sadducee. You imagine this? Dad's a Sadducee, younger son's a Sadducee. Mom's a Pharisee, older son's a Pharisee. What a fun Thanksgiving table that would be. So the younger son, Aristobulus II, towards the end of Salome's life, started to make a couple of power grabs to try to set himself up to inherit the throne once she died, because it was going to go to Hyrcanus II, who had been serving as high priest for 30 years. And after she died in 76 BC, and you can tell, 76, we're getting really close to Jesus at this point, their struggle for power, the two brothers, for power over the crown and over the high priesthood, would signal the end of the Hasmonean dynasty and Jewish independence as we know it until the 1900s. But before we get into these two brothers and their absurdities, I just want to reiterate something. That in the 100 years of independence, Judea only had one good, faithful, and wise leader. They had one leader who could unite the people without bloodshed. One leader who could even begin to heal the wounds of these two political powers. One leader who was not solely driven by power and riches and pride. And that leader is the one that is least written about just because she was a woman. The Dead Sea Scrolls mention her a couple of times, but only in derogatory ways, calling her a harlot and, all of these things that are meant to demean her because she's a woman. They said so specifically, that she's a woman. She shouldn't be they shouldn't have a queen over Judea. And despite the fact that she was by far the most qualified and successful Hasmonean ruler, we have more propaganda preserved than we do actual history of her. And this is so often the case with history, mostly because history is written after the fact, by the people who won. And so whoever controls the present moment when the history is being written, in some way controls the past, or at least how the past is told. And how the past is told impacts or informs the present and controls how the future unfolds, which is a complicated way of saying, as is said in the novel 1984, whoever controls the present controls the past, and whoever controls the past controls the future. So as a critical analysis of history requires us to untangle some of these biases in order to get closer to the truth, to understand that Josephus, for example, really hated Pharisees and was not a fan of powerful women. And so we need to read that into his histories. But the truth of the matter is this, that we need more women in every level of leadership in society because they seem to be far less disastrous than the men. Sorry, it's just truth. Speaking as a man. Like, for example, the book of Judges, every judge is just an incompetent bozo, except for one, which is Deborah. This is a trend throughout history. But I'll go much more into detail into this when in 2 weeks, when Herod gets totally bamboozled by Cleopatra and he throws a hissy fit, and it's wonderful. But before I get too far ahead of myself, be sure to tune in next week, because the Romans have picked up an appetite for empire, and Judea, suddenly in chaos, is low-hanging fruit. So I'll see you then. Right. Welcome back. Bruce, a heads up, you're still muted. There you go.
No, I'm not.
Now you're not.
How do you spell her name?
Salome?
Yeah.
Salome.
So Salome is
Her,
the different character?
her name means peace. In what way? Which person are you thinking of?
I remember some reference in the Bible to a character named Salome.
Yes.
And maybe that's a mispronunciation of Salome.
I mean, they're both accepted.
Okay.
As best as I can tell, they're both accepted pronunciations. The
So
one
it's the
you're
same
thinking
person.
of
Go
was
ahead.
the daughter of Herodias, who was Herod Antipas's wife, the one who danced for him and he was drunk and he's like, I'll give you anything you want. And she said, I want
Yeah.
John the Baptist's head on a plate. That one. Yeah, different person.
Okay.
And how did you pronounce her name?
I
Still
pronounced
this.
them both Salome, but we could say Salome. Salome.
Okay. It's interesting because one of my favorite people is an Amish woman up in Potter County.
Hmm.
And we just spent time visiting them when we were up there. And her name is Soloma. And,
Saloma.
and she is an extremely powerful Amish lady.
Hmm.
You do not push Saloma around, and I just love her. She's a joy to be around, and they are just a remarkable and wonderful couple.
Hmm. So, aside from pronunciations, are there any other clarifying questions about what you just heard?
Who are the Sanhedrin? You were saying they were a group.
Mhm.
Who did they consist of?
Yeah, great question. If you'll remember long, long, long ago when we talked about them returning from exile and getting back into the land, and Ezra put together a council of elders who
Okay.
were like the bigwigs who edited down the Bible and did all of that. And so from that point on, there's kind of this ruling body in
Okay.
Jerusalem of comprised of elders and priests and scribes and the kind of who's who of it all.
They're not Sanhedrin or
So
Pharisees then, or
this
are
is this is when um, Salome forms the Sanhedrin, which consists of Pharisees and Sadducees.
okay.
So you can think of the Sanhedrin as the Supreme Court of Judea.
Okay.
Um, you've probably heard the word Sanhedrin around, especially when we go to Easter time,
Okay.
because Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin. Yeah, because on matters of law, they were given kind of autonomy.
So they were the ones that were supposed to probably know more about each law or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Okay.
say you were having a fire and you were cooking your food, and a bit of your fire caught your neighbor's house on fire, and it burned down, and it was an accident, and you didn't mean to do it, and it wasn't your fault, and they shouldn't have had their wheat outside drying, and so they demand full recompense, and you say no way, and so you bring that to the Sanhedrin, and so the
Okay.
elders would then say, well, according to the Torah in this part of Leviticus, and then interpreting it by this way, by this
Okay.
yeah, and then they'd say, here's what you have to do,
Okay.
and then if you say no, then the king gets involved and law enforcement gets involved.
Okay.
So the Sanhedrin in Jesus's time had the ability to judge on anything and to give any punishment down except for the death penalty.
Okay.
Only the Romans could give the death penalty, but they could do anything else.
Okay.
Just between the three of us, do you in your mind reference the fact that this message has certain strong pertinence right now because of the election and the possibility of seeing the major role that will be assumed by a woman for the first time in our country. Do you see this as a kind of transitional period into something new and different and more positive?
You know, it's funny. I was thinking about our current situation, but not in that regard. I was thinking of the fact that in order to bring some sense of equality to the warring factions, Salome packed the court with Pharisees,
Yeah.
so, so that there would be more equal representation among the liberals and conservatives on the Supreme Court, as it were.
Life never changes.
Right, which didn't go over super well among the conservative Sadducees, and yeah, she had to create little fortresses for them outside of the city so they'd be safe.
But there's always the same thing. You have this person complaining about this and that person complaining about that. And it's all about power and who's in control. And
Yeah.
it all through history, that's the way it goes. At least in my opinion, that's the way I see it.
Well, and you know, for the Sadducees that were on the court at that time, it must have felt unfair that,
Okay.
oh, so this person gets to be on the Sanhedrin just because they're a Pharisee, not because they're any smarter or more qualified, but just because they're a Pharisee, they get to have special treatment. Well, I didn't get special treatment. I had to earn my place on the Sanhedrin. And, you know, Salome's trying to bring equal representation. And so in order to do that, you have to be unfair to the people currently in power in order to tip the scales a bit in the other direction, right? Somebody has to lose power in order for someone else to gain power. And that we see that as well today. But no, Bruce, to your question, I think that anytime we get women in positions of high leadership, it's good for everyone. Just in terms like, yeah, I hate to do the whole like men's brains and women's brains are different thing, because gender is biologically, neurologically, gender is a lot more of a spectrum than a man brain, woman brain. But generally speaking, women's brains have a lot more connections between things. Men's
Well,
brains,
everybody sees something different. I mean, you bring a different perspective
yeah, men's
to the
brains do a
problem.
lot of back to front, you know, problem to solution, problem to solution. Women's brains tend to see a lot more possibility, a lot more connection between things. And so they're able to see a lot more subtleties in situations. And so you see like little girls are typically more relationally focused than little boys, because they're able to conceptualize relationships at an earlier age than boys
Getting
are,
along
generally
easy.
speaking. These are obviously big generalizations that are not true of individuals, but of large groups. So, you know, more women, powerful women who can see subtleties in relational situations, I think is better for the world governments.
I'll go along with that.
Not every woman leader in the Bible is a great leader, but it just so happened that we have a couple of really good examples, and then a lot of catastrophic men. Just wait until we get to
Every
Herod.
person
I have a lot to say about Herod.
everybody has good and bad in them,
Mhm.
man or woman. And I guess there's a way that it could go the opposite if there's a woman in charge too.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure. So I want to jump ahead to, did you know that it's quite possible that the ancient Jews invented public school?
I was thinking of that. So their system was similar to ours as far as,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay,
state funded, and it would be free education for children, and all children were expected to at least go to the first level of Torah school, where they would learn the alphabet and they would learn the Torah, and they'd learn by memorizing.
okay.
If you were good enough to go on to that, you would then learn the prophets and the writings, and you'd also memorize those. And then if you were really good at that, you'd go on to the next level where you would learn the oral tradition, the oral law, and then the best of the best would then go on to apprentice under a rabbi, and would then listen to that rabbi discuss for like a couple of years before they started engaging, because it was important to learn how to debate before you were brought in.
So how old were they when they started, and how long did they go then?
I think like 5 or 6 is when you started school. And
Okay,
then by the time you were a young adult, you'd be out
kind of
there
like
doing your thing.
what we do now, as far
Yeah.
as age-wise go.
And you wouldn't expect a person to be their own independent rabbi until their 30s, which is about the time that Jesus does it. So that would have been about the right age for a person to kind of start teaching on their own without their mentor. Yeah, and prior to that, it was expected that the father would teach the son all about the Torah and about the law and about God and our sacred stories.
But the
And
ladies or the girls never learned that, right?
not really, other than what they picked up around the house.
Okay.
And so you might also imagine that the stories were maybe slightly different house to house, depending on how
Mhm.
good a teacher the dad was. But how many kids don't have dads, especially in times of war? And so those kids either didn't get educated, or maybe some uncle helped them, or if they were rich enough, they could go to Jerusalem and they could be taught there. But
Did they learn reading and writing and things then, or was it all oral?
so we're not entirely sure how much they learned. They at least learned the alphabet, and the further along you went in school, the more you learned how to read.
Mhm.
Writing was reserved because paper is expensive, but
Okay.
most kids would have at least been able to identify language. Though widespread literacy wasn't really all that common because there's not a lot of writing. That's not extremely expensive to own. But like if you think about the implications for the time of Jesus. So this is all taking place about 100 years before Jesus was born. A little bit less than 100 years, 80 years or so. And so we've got 2 generations of kids who have grown up with public education in some way, shape, or form. So Jesus comes on the scene, likely receives some education. He's got enough education to be able to read from the Isaiah scroll in the beginning of Luke. So we know he can read. And then he goes around teaching people. But those people that he's teaching, though they're common people, they've gone to at least some school, and they know the stories, and they've been instructed as youngsters. So they may be more receptive to hearing a reinterpretation of scripture that Jesus brings than maybe they would have a couple of generations before when they weren't educated.
For clarification, would you refresh for me the sources of materials that they were using as distinguishing between the Torah and the Talmud?
Okay, yeah. So when I say Torah, there's a couple of different things that means. The written Torah is the law, so the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Pentateuch. And there's the oral Torah, which is the oral tradition that is handed down between rabbis. The Talmud is a much later writing that comes mostly out of Babylon, a couple hundred years after Jesus, which is the compilation of all of the rabbinic sayings and debates. So some of what's in the Talmud can be traced back to this time when the Pharisees are having these discussions and debates. But the Talmud is a separate thing that much later, and you'll hear modern Jews use the Talmud.
So our Old Testament includes both of these?
No.
Okay.
Our Old Testament contains 3 sections. The Torah, which is the law, the first 5 books, the prophets, which are all of the named books, and the writings, which include what we would think of as the histories and the stories and the poetry and the wisdom literature. So another Jewish word for that is the Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah and I can't think of the other ones. So then if you were to go into a library in a synagogue and you were to look at what the holy texts were today, you would have the Tanakh, the Bible, and then you would have the Talmud, which is a separate huge compendium of dozens of volumes of work, of commentary upon commentary upon commentary on the scriptures.
So the Christian community has not embraced anything from the Talmud?
No.
Or hasn't been influenced by it?
Not officially. No, we kind of, modern Judaism and Christianity are two streams that come from the same river. The rabbinic movement and the Jesus movement both start at about the same time, and then they diverge pretty quickly. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the early church and a lot of persecution of the Jews. And so we kind of stopped talking to each other.
Okay.
Unfortunately. There's still a lot of anti-Semitism. I don't know if you've noticed.
No, that's a strange comment. I haven't ever seen that to be the case. Yeah. Except every day.
Yeah, I was just on a call with my good friend, the Rabbi Jackson, and she was in her office with telling me that they have 16 security cameras around the synagogue, and the doors are always locked. They're never left unlocked because they have to be. Because at any moment they could and they have been victims of anti-Semitic violence. Usually from Christians. Yeah, we like to think that it's the Jews that killed Jesus when it was really the Romans who killed Jesus.
Yeah, but I'm always trying to figure out, I see those 5 people, and I'm trying to figure out which is the rabbi of the 2 gals.
Oh, well, you can check our website for that.
Her website.
Our website. Okay. Go to the hosts as a different conversation. But yeah, where were we saying? Yeah, so the Christians don't really use anything from the Talmud.
Okay.
We should.
I don't feel guilty about not knowing very much about it at all.
No. It's enough to know even what happens in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. You know, it's if you can even keep those things straight, then that's more than enough. Anything above that's extra credit.
I'm hoping this adventure here with you is bringing me a little further along that line.
Sure, I'm giving you some things that aren't in the Bible, so I don't know if anyone has ever talked to you about the fact that the Sadducee high priest crucified 800 Pharisees on the main road and murdered their families in front of them while eating a great feast and laughing about it.
Never heard that before.
No, which I don't know why that's not like the first thing we say when we talk about the Pharisees and Sadducees having disagreements, we always go straight to the doctrinal disagreements.
Not the way they were treated.
Right. And we act as if that's it. That it's just like they can't agree on whether there's a heaven or not. When really, this is a political power dynamic here with generations of violence and abuses.
Which is always around among everybody.
Yeah.
Not just the Jewish people and Christians, it's everybody.
Well, and you also got to think, like, when Jesus comes around and John the Baptist, and they are up in arms. Like, you read John the Baptist's words when the Pharisees and Sadducees come to to the river, and he says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Like, this is the sort of history that they're imagining, that these people are supposed to be religious leaders. These are the people that are supposed to be interpreting the law for the
And
God of
setting an
peace.
example for us.
And the high priest is supposed to be setting an example. When we have this example, this is our example of how the religious leaders have handled themselves. They've been more concerned with power and wealth and prestige than actually being faithful to God.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that Jesus turns over tables and the early church
Just be a
gets
little
persecuted.
upset.
Right? Paul comes back from his missionary journeys, and the religious leaders are like, now's our chance. We have to arrest this guy and make up charges about what he's done, because we can't let him keep teaching because he's eating into our power base. Right? Because Paul and the early church are out among the common people, and they're ignoring the religious elites, and they're out with the common people, and they're converting people, which means there's fewer people giving money to the temple. There's fewer people listening to the religious leaders, and they're like an existential threat.
Yep. Well, I wrote this down. It's like, we keep looking and searching for information to prove that whatever we believe is right, and how we're to worship God is the way we do it, not the way you do it. So this has been going on since day one, from way back. And the only really thing that's unites us is if it's told to love God and to love each other. And those are only the two things that we really need to do. And we keep pushing and digging and rooting around and stuff, and making more problems instead of solving them. Oh, at least that's what I wrote down. That's
It's a good point. And it does seem that a lot of these movements start there. And then the longer they go, they forget that and they lose focus. They start with righteousness and getting back to God, and then they get power and they forget it.
You'd think after 2,000 years we would have learned something.
Well, give us a little bit of credit. We've learned a few things.
Well, it just seems like it keeps repeating itself.
Well, those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it, right? It's
I guess.
George Santayana. So
Maybe we all need to go back and kind of get a history like what we're getting now to see why. And maybe that would help us to understand better. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we said a couple of weeks ago when the Maccabean revolt happened, and the family became the rulers and then set themselves up as high priests as well, which, was a really convenient solution to have them both be the same thing. But it felt a little wrong to have the political leader and the religious leader be one and the same. And it just felt like it might get messy. And it did.
Yeah.
And that also then happened with the Pope. It's happened in the United States. Any time in history where we get political power with like the army behind it and the law enforcement, and we mix it with religious power, which is supposed to be bringing us closer to God and to each other, the political power ends up overpowering, right? And people lose focus on God. It rarely happens the other way, where they lose focus on earthly power.
Yeah.
And so, maybe we take that as a lesson, as a lesson that our job as religious leaders, as religious people, is not to gain earthly power, but to hold it accountable, to be moral leaders, and to hold those people accountable at the top, but not try to be them and take their power.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe. So all that to say, I'm not running for office, if that's what you were wondering. Oh, goodness, no. All right. Well, so this
As we get
this
to the close, I wanted
yeah.
to say I appreciated this session and wanted to express the fact, and I think I already did, of your podcast for this week on gratitude. Really struck home for me. I thought it was so well done and in accord with my current thinking. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And Karen, I'll share this with you, and that what Bruce is talking about is my my separate podcast, and we talked a lot about the scientific and religious aspects of gratitude and how we know it affects the individual. And my friend Rachel was sharing that in the Jewish tradition, they have a short prayer they say before the meal. Yeah,
Okay.
10-second prayer, like a bless this meal.
That in your, what do you call it?
Like grace.
Communicator.
Oh, did I put that in there? That
Yeah.
after prayer? Oh, that's right. That was this month. Yeah. So after the meal, there's a 3-minute prayer of gratitude, and
Is great.
I love that. That insight is just so wonderful, that after the thing you've received, that you spend more time
Thanking.
being thankful for it.
And then it makes you realize how much went into getting that.
Mm.
Like if you're saying a grace for your meal, it's just not that you cooked it. It's somebody that grew it, somebody that processed it, somebody that transported it. So you've got more persons involved in being thankful for than just my cooking it. So,
Yeah, that's a beautiful point.
It also impacts significantly of the mindfulness aspect of actually eating. That during the act of eating, you start to think about how that food got to you, what,
right.
In my case and in your case, not in Zach's case, what the tastes are, what the smells are, what the textures are, and all of this. I find particularly with this intermittent fasting that I'm so much more conscious of the food that I'm eating. And I hardly ever end up with a meal without saying, "This was great. This was a marvelous experience. Thank you, Kathy. You did a wonderful job." And I think that is wholesome in a lot of ways, but that concept of mindfulness really works for me in terms of eating.
But it can work that way in whatever you're doing, really, because we're dependent. Each one of us is dependent on more people getting us where we are than we realize. I mean, this pandemic has really opened my eyes to see that I depend on people delivering my groceries to me, or going to the store and actually picking up the stupid little things that I want. So, that makes me more aware of what we're all more dependent on each other than we think.
That's beautiful.
So, that's one thing that this pandemic has kind of done.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And thank you to both of you. I'm grateful for you and for everyone that is in my life right now who's consistently pouring new wisdom into my life.